Hello everyone, my name is Phang Kok Jun and I'm the composer for this piece, The Courage for Peace, which is inspired by the story of Mrs Elizabeth Choy. Now for those who don't know, Mrs Elizabeth Choy was actually a war heroine during World War II in Singapore. Now she was actually known to be someone who courageously helped the injured British soldiers by delivering supplies and goods for them, and when she was actually caught eventually, she was captured for almost 200 days, or 193 days to be exact. Thankfully, she survived the ordeal and had this story to tell, and it's also a very stark reminder to all of us that we cannot take for granted the peace and the freedom that we enjoy today. Now, this piece is very programmatic by nature, which means that it tries to tell the story in a more chronological way, in a more descriptive manner. Now, at the very beginning of the piece, we're actually setting the scene for the war, and you can hear a lot of confusion, there's a lot of things happening. And through that, there was this theme of sadness that was established in rehearsal G. But through this melancholy, there rises a voice of courage, of power, and that comes in rehearsal K. Now over here on rehearsal L, you actually hear a bit of a description of what Mrs. Choy did during the war, which is that there were calls for help and she delivered. You might be able to see it from the musical gestures over here, where there is a bell or a ring from the piano, and then the soloist actually reaches out to these various notes. Following which, at rehearsal O and going to rehearsal P, we actually get a bit of a tension as, eventually, unfortunately, she was discovered by the Japanese Kempeitai soldiers and she was caught. And in rehearsal U, what I did was I researched on some of the horrible things that Mrs. Choy had to go through, and a lot of the gestures that the musician plays in rehearsal U is a physical representation of what Mrs. Choy herself had to go through. Thankfully, as I said, she survived the war, and the piece ends with a more hopeful note at rehearsal Y all the way till the end. Now, I'm not a zhongruan musician myself, but I do spend time to experiment with, as well as research for not only this piece, but for all the various zhongruan concertos that I've written earlier. I always find that the zhongruan has two sides. It can have a very powerful and aggressive nature through its strumming and all sorts of different techniques of playing, but at the same time, we can also use the zhongruan to be lyrical, to have a warm voice. Such an instrument like the zhongruan can properly convey this whole scope of sounds, of effects, of tension, of music, of phrases. It's a wonderful instrument for this particular narrative. Now, for musicians who are playing this piece, will find that most of the gestures should be quite idiomatic for this instrument. But you might find that there are some gestures that I was notified that there was a few particular notes that might be a bit high for this instrument. Now, this was deliberately included in this piece because not only do I want to challenge the musicians, it's also these are moments that I would like to use these high notes as to show this intense tension that is actually the point of emotion in this particular story, and I do hope that you appreciate that these notes are included inside the piece. If you don't already know the story of Mrs. Elizabeth Choy, I would really encourage you to get familiar with it. Not only does it help you understand the flow and the narrative and the emotions behind this piece, I think it's just wonderful to be able to know and be inspired by a Singapore war heroine's story, and I think more people should know that, and I hope that young musicians will also be inspired by the courageous acts that she did during the war as well. I would also like to take this opportunity to thank the estate of Mrs. Elizabeth Choy for letting us use this inspiring story, and in hopes that it will continue to inspire the next young generation of musicians. I wish all the competitors all the best for putting this piece together, but most importantly, I do hope that you have a meaningful experience by putting this piece together and performing on the stage during the competition. All the best and thank you.